Our next speaker is James Lyons-Weiler, PhD. James is a genetic research scientist, author, founder and CEO of the Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge, also known as IPAC. He's written 3 books, Ebola, Cures versus Profits, and the Genetic and Environmental Causes of Autism. James, along with other scientists at IPAC, conduct research on behalf of public interest that is aimed at finding ways to reduce human suffering. Please welcome Dr. James Lyons-Weiler.
It's occasions like these that I do what I do for families like the Bailey family. When I was working at the University of Pittsburgh, I worked there for 16 years. I had a choice to work in the cancer center or work on the other side of campus. And I chose the cancer center, and the reason why I chose the cancer center was because Mom died of breast cancer when I was 4 years old. So my heart goes out to you. I have some financial conflicts of interest to disclose. I consult on vaccine injury cases. But I do it for the right reason. And I want to assure you and anyone who sees the video from today's event that the things that I say to you today about what I found in looking over Michael Bailey's medical records and looking at what the doctors had to say about him and looking at the scientific and biomedical literature, that any reasonable biomedical researcher would come to the same conclusions that I've come to today. That said, I work for a not-for-profit. So unfortunately, me as a person and as a non-citizen of Ohio, I can't recommend the legislation that you're going to hear about today because I have to protect my institution from accusations that we're a lobbying organization. So I'm not here in support of any particular legislation. I'm here for the family. So what we're going to get down to today from my presentation is the question, did Michael Bailey have Guillain-Barre syndrome or did he have ALS? ALS is, as you may well know, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. So I'm a lifelong biomedical research scientist. At the University of Pittsburgh, I designed and conducted with collaborators over 100 biomedical research projects, studies. I was in charge of the data analysis of these mostly through the bioinformatics analysis core, in which I would meet with investigators, that is, medical doctors, clinicians, nurses who were doing research, who wanted to do research with genetics and genomics and something called proteomics, studies of proteins in the body. And they would meet with me for about an hour, and they got the first 45 minutes to talk to me about science. I had the best job in the world. I had people coming to me, speaking with me about all kinds of biomedical research studies at one of the world's leading research institutions. And I soaked it up like a sponge. And then I gave myself the last 15 minutes where I said, okay, if you want to study this problem, this is what you might want to do. And I helped them design the study and come up with a plan by which which tissues they would use, which laboratories they would use at the university to get the data. And the plan was then that the data would come back to me and my staff. I had a staff of 4 people working for me. And we would analyze the data, come to our interpretation, put a report together, and then communicate that report back to them in 2 weeks from the time that we got the data. That's how we got 100 research studies done. And I was very proud to have that position. I enjoyed it. It was the best job in the world. I now have the best job in the world again. But I've done research on diseases of the central nervous system, but many, many other things too, as well as the immune system. I could go on for about 4 hours. Most of you have heard me speak before about the specific biological mechanisms of vaccine injury. But I won't go much into that today. But we know that vaccines, some of them like the flu vaccine, contain thimerosal, which can damage mitochondria. The mitochondria are the powerhouse, the energy source of the cell. And it can actually create mutations within the mitochondria that are new. They're not inherited. The mitochondria is absolutely essential to drive all the cellular processes forward that you might need just to get through your day. And that includes detoxification of your cells. You can't do anything. It includes cellular respiration, it includes cellular division. The endoplasmic reticulum is kind of the chute in which, or the part of the cell in which the proteins are folded. And endoplasmic reticulum stress forms the basis of much of the diseases that we suffer from today. And it's known that thimerosal, which contains ethylmercury, induces ER stress, endoplasmic reticulum stress, so you can't fold your proteins very well. Specifically, thimerosal contains ethylmercury, but thimerosal itself as a molecule specifically inhibits one of the proteins that is responsible for shortening and folding proteins that we need for our immune system. It's called ERAP1. And if you can't use your ERAP1 protein because you got a shot of flu vaccine with mercury in it, you can't make the proteins that your immune systems need to fight off pathogens such as respiratory viruses that you're already immune to. So ironically and sadly, thimerosal can cause immune dysfunction. It can cause you to become immunocompromised. The temporariness or the permanence of that will vary from person to person based on their genetics. Aluminum is an adjuvant in the vaccine that causes an immune response, and it's there that's supposed to help the vaccine work. But it also causes ER stress, and this ER stress stops many, many different kinds of proteins from folding appropriately. And so these adjuvants, they're not just there to help the vaccine, they're there to help the vaccine, but they also make us sick. And when you have endoplasmic reticulum stress, the cell has three options. It can say, I'm going to stop making proteins, which is not healthy, but it could resolve. It could say, I'm going to clear out these proteins and get these chaperone proteins to escort these unfolded proteins out of the cell and detoxify. Or it can undergo apoptosis, which is cellular death, and die, and spill its contents out into the surrounding tissue, which involves a whole lot of signaling. There's signaling, intracellular signaling when a cell dies. There's cytokines that say, hey, there's a problem here, I'm injured. If you get a blunt trauma injury to the head, traumatic brain injury, you're going to experience apoptosis, and that tells your brain you have an injury. When you have a vaccine-induced brain injury, nobody can see the bruise on your head. Nobody knows that you fell down 2 flights of stairs. We just have a little shot, that's all. The third area of biological mechanisms of vaccine injury it falls under autoimmunity. And there's absolutely no doubt that vaccines can cause autoimmunity, and no doubt that they can cause food allergies. Scientists routinely induce both food allergies and autoimmunity and other diseases using aluminum hydroxide alone on the animals, and then they feed them peanuts and they develop peanut allergies. But if you're a person and you're given the flu shot or you're given another shot and you go home and eat a peanut butter sandwich and you end up with a peanut allergy, it wasn't the vaccines, it's coincidence. It's amazing. So we have a disconnect between the science of the biological mechanisms of vaccine and the clinical science in which they try to seek associations of these outcomes of vaccine injury, studying entire populations when in reality they only occur to a small genetic minority, which is not that small. And it's heterogeneous, but I'll move on. An example of autoimmunity that's proven is autoimmunity against hypocretin. It's a protein that's expressed in the brain. It regulates the sleep-wake cycle. And one of the flu vaccines against H1N1 caused people to develop narcolepsy. There was initially a study from Stanford University that said we found the cross-reactive antibodies that proves that it was this vaccine, but they couldn't reproduce that. Then they found that it wasn't the cross-reactive antibodies against hypocretin itself, but instead it was against the hypocretin receptor protein. That's a subtle difference, but it's still proof. If you're concerned about autoimmunity, what you have is the in the presence of an adjuvant like aluminum, the body learns to attack not only the pathogen protein, but any protein in the body that looks exactly like the pathogen protein by chance. And what's happening to our population is that there's genetic diversity within our population that causes any of our immune systems, any of our proteins in any of our tissues to happen to be a little bit more similar to a pathogen protein than the person sitting next to you. That's a genetic minority. And because it's genetic, they're potentially identifiable and they're equal. The clause for equal protection under the law applies. Our society hasn't woken up to this fact yet. The letters that you see on the top here are the amino acids that align very well between the human and the flu virus protein. So if you take human proteins and you put them into, say, a pig, with adjuvant, and they match very well, the pig is going to develop autoimmunity. This is routinely done. But if you take a viral protein and you put it into a human being and you give them an adjuvant and they develop autoimmunity, it wasn't the vaccine, it's a coincidence. We have to change the way that we weight the evidence from science. The clinical studies on association between vaccine injury and the entire population, where we say it's just a coincidence, correlation doesn't equal causation, that's broken. Those studies are woefully misused by design. Remember, I'm an expert in study design. I did over 100 studies. They're wrongly designed from the beginning. If somebody came to me and said, hey, I want to find out whether vaccines cause, say, a food allergy, I would say, okay, what you want to do is you want to take a bunch of people who have food allergies and have the vaccine, and take a bunch of people who didn't, and find out what the difference is between them. Instead, what they do is they say, look at everybody in the population, and just see if we can find this random statistical association in the population somehow, considering everybody, including people who didn't get the vaccine, including people who did get the vaccine, including people who had the adjuvant, had the adverse outcome, and those that didn't. We need injured versus not injured, not vaxxed versus unvaxxed. We need that much more. It's much more important to find out exactly which people in the population are going to experience adverse events from vaccines so that we can protect them. So that we can put up a biomarker screen and we can say, you know what, we're going to look at these panels here of genetics or these panels and we're going to say, hey, you're at high risk. We're going to skip this one. That would be rational medicine. One of the greatest lines of evidence that we have that autoimmunity can happen as a result of vaccines is the evolution of multiple sclerosis incidents in France after they brought the hepatitis B vaccination to France. And this is a published peer-reviewed article from 2014 in which the incidence of MS was low in 1984, and then they brought in the hepatitis B vaccine, and you can see that the uptake of the vaccine and the incidence of hepatitis B vaccine rose concurrently. The French Department of Health took a look at this and said, there seems to be too tight of a correlation. Let's see what happens if we don't recommend hepatitis B vaccination anymore, and we're going to stop buying them. And as the vaccines work their way through the system and people stop vaccinating, you can see with the white line being the vaccine uptake and the black line being hepatitis B, this is a causal relationship. This is the tightest causal relationship that you can imagine. It proves, as much as science can prove anything, that the vaccine caused the increase in hepatitis B. What is that? Is that, everyone who got the hepatitis B developed MS? No. Nobody said that. A minority of people did, but those people matter. So, I got to go quickly because I want to take my time, but there is a massive amount of literature support for Guillain-Barre syndrome. This is demyelination syndrome from vaccines, but it can happen from other causes as well. The risk is real. It's recognized as real. However, it's extremely small at the population level. GBS can also have antecedent conditions that are recognized, but not always. And it can occur due to something called molecular mimicry, that similarity between a virus or a bacterium mostly a virus, and proteins or epitopes on Schwann cells in the nervous system. The Fluarix vaccine is the vaccine I believe that Michael Bailey received, if memory serves. And in this, I'll just quickly read the list of ingredients. There's egg albumin, there's egg protein, formaldehyde or formalin, gentamicin, hydrocortisone, octazynol 10, alpha-tocylferol, I'm not going to read all those, polysorbate 80, and so on, and a trace amount of thimerosal. But it also includes the flu virus proteins, okay? There are contraindications for Fluarix, which includes Guillain-Barre syndrome. I highly doubt, although I do not know, that Michael Bailey's doctor told him that he could have a risk of Guillain-Barre syndrome from this vaccine. Given the current state of medical practice around vaccinations, since the dogma is reduce your patient's awareness of risk at all cost and increase vaccine uptake for the greater good, there's a denial of informed consent that happens each and every day, in every state, in every county, in most medical practices. Guillain-Barre syndrome is an autoimmune attack. The attack occurs on the peripheral nerve myelin. Its characteristics are rapid onset of progression, perforation of the Schwann cells, then it stabilizes, and most people have a spontaneous recovery. Which involves a reconstitution of the myelin sheath. The course can take months or even years, and very severely affected people can recover completely. That requires a clinical intervention called immunomodulation therapy, where they take control of the immune system and they shut it down for a little while. You can take plasmapheresis, and you can have a step done that removes the circulating cross-reactive antibodies. And you can receive human immunoglobulin infusions that reduce immunity to the nonspecific type of autoimmunity. Rapid onset is very important here. So Michael Bailey was, his doctor said that he couldn't really support an ALS diagnosis to begin with because it happened too quickly. The onset was too fast. And if we look at there's difficulties in the differential diagnosis of ALS and GBS. First of all, it's all done on symptomology and neurological tests. It's not done on a biomarker. It's not done with something that is 99% specific, 99% sensitive. So there are some rare conditions that are known to mimic GBS, such as a chronic inflammatory demyelinating radial neuropathy, or CIDP. How do they determine CIDP versus GBS? If the patient recovers from an if they have a diagnosis of GBS, I should say GBS, if they give them an immunomodulation therapy and they recover, they say, if they don't recover, they say, well, maybe you didn't have CIDP. But nevertheless, CIDP patients can still improve. The neurological examination alone is not enough to distinguish between sporadic and familial forms of ALS. So the science isn't there, the medicine is not there, the differential diagnosis is very, very gray. And there's a consensus that's evolving that GBS and ALS exist on some kind of a spectrum. So there may be a continuum that we can understand if we take abroad. The other thing is that conditions can co-occur. There's comorbid conditions that can co-occur with GBS. Let's look at GBS versus ALS more closely. Both have weakness, both have pain and a loss of motor function, but the pain is less in one of them. I'm going to tell you later. I don't remember off the top of my head which one. There's large variation in presentation in both of them in terms of the rates of deterioration of motor function, especially within GBS. As I said, diagnosis is made on symptoms alone. There's no biomarker. And the biomarker that was attempted, it's a biomarker called TDP43. It's a protein. It only had a very low accuracy to distinguish between ALS and GBS, very low specificity, very low sensitivity. So it wasn't clinically useful. But there are some subtle differences here. So for GBS, your reflexes become weak. In ALS, they can stay strong, and actually they can become enhanced. In GBS, the pain is present, there it is, or in ALS, you typically don't feel any pain. In GBS, you do not have fasciculations. These are tremors, these are shakes. In ALS, you do. In GBS versus ALS, there's differences in the causes of the disease as well. ALS involves a loss of innervating motor neurons. These are neurons that are actually responsible for control in the brain, that are responsible for controlling body movements, as opposed to GBS, which is a demyelination disorder, where you have demyelination of motor neurons. Now, demyelination involves you have a nerve has a sheath around it, and that's responsible for the conduct of, it's like an insulating sheath around a wire. And it provides the ability for the electrical chemical signal to propagate along the nerve. And there's a variety of causes from GBS, whereas ALS is thought to be primarily genetic without an environmental component. Let's look at what Mr. Bailey experienced. He had heart palpitations, he had diarrhea, he had headaches, and he had dizziness. These were the very early symptoms. And as Dr. Piorio indicated, these symptoms are not consistent at all with the diagnosis of ALS. He also experienced prickling in his hands, weaknesses in his legs that spread to the upper body, difficulty in eye and facial movement, difficulty in chest and chewing and swallowing, pain and difficulty with the bladder. So the onset, the rapid onset, is also inconsistent with ALS. I looked at the medical literature. This is what I do with most of my time at this point in time, as I synthesize an understanding of knowledge from hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of research studies. And the required diagnostic criteria for GBS include progressive symmetric weakness from more than one limb, hyperreflexia or aflexia, or progression, that means the loss of reflexes. There could be symmetric weakness. Additional helpful diagnostic indicators are sensory symptoms with the CF protein elevation. You could look at that. Electrophysiologic features of demyelination and recovery. Mr. Bailey showed fasciculations and good reflexes, both favoring ALS. However, the electrodiagnostics that were done were completely equivocal. So he only met probable ALS under the not strongly supported. The timing of the onset is completely inconsistent with ALS. So we have a complicated situation here. It's not 100% clear cut, looked at this level. But he had other symptoms that were a tie. It could go either way. He had hemifacial paralysis. That means his face was partially paralyzed. That was consistent with GBS or ALS. Now, some of the symptoms that I'm saying, the family knows the progression, and they may have worsened or changed over time before Mr. Bailey passed. But that symptom is consistent with acute bulbar palsy. It's seen in rare forms of both GBS and ALS, so it's not really informative. Now, Guillain-Barre syndrome, however, mostly begins with tingling and weakness in the feet and legs. That supports GBS. But in about 10% of the people, the symptoms begin in the arm or the face. So with Mr. Bailey, it started in the legs. That favors GBS. Then there's some other progress, progression of the disease condition. He lost bowel function, he lost bladder function, and other kinds of senses that are much more consistent with GBS. Okay, he had heart palpitations. They support GBS, not ALS. And you usually only see heart palpitations if you're given a drug, a specific drug, or type of treatment. And to my knowledge, Mr. Bailey was not given these. It's not in the medical record. While he had a pre-existing carpal tunnel syndrome, that's not an indicator for ALS or GBS. But it's important to understand he exhibited no prior symptoms before the onset. None, zero. He was as healthy as an ox. There's tales of Michael Bailey. He's like the Paul Bunyan of our time that I know about. Jim Blumenstiel told me the story about how when he was at a church function and they were doing tug of war, Michael Bailey was the anchor, and all 6 of his teammates fell down, and he held on while the other 7 guys on the other side tried to pull him into the ditch. And he held strong until his teammates scrambled and got up, and then they pulled the other guys into the ditch. No pre-existing condition. I can't stress that enough for this differential diagnosis. Now, the doctor who vaccinated Mr. Bailey told Mr. and Mrs. Bailey when the symptoms came on that he had seen 4 other patients with the same kinds of symptoms from the same vaccine, but that he would never repeat that to anyone. We're not in illegal proceedings here. That's hearsay. But I'm telling you, if a doctor sees 4 or 5 patients in their practice from the same vaccine having the same symptoms, they need to look at that vaccine. They need to do much more than just talk to the patient one-on-one. They need to clamor to the AMA. They need to go to the CDC. They need to go to the local health department, something, and say, hey, maybe there's a batch effect. Maybe there's something wrong with this. So far as ALS goes, as far as I know, and medical records show, there's no history of ALS in the family at all. Thank you, Danette. There was a loss of information processing speed, completely inconsistent with ALS, not inconsistent and supportive of GBS. And as things tend to be, there can be complications. GBS, you have a diagnosis of GBS? I looked at the literature. There's people walking around, recovering from GBS, but they also have other conditions that are also demyelinating because multiple tissues are affected. And there are some people that were given a diagnosis of both ALS and GBS. How do you like that? Well, because they found evidence of both. So how can we sit here and ask this question of GBS versus ALS when there's genetic variation that determines the degree and severity and the types of tissues where the autoimmune attack takes place, and science has not kept up with the technology and the expansion of flu vaccines, because when they look, or any vaccine, because when they look at safety, they look at short-term safety. They don't look at long-term safety. When they look at safety, they say, yes, we have short-term safety, and we're going to look at it for 4 days or 4 weeks or some small period of time. But then for long-term safety, we're going to release the vaccine to the market, and then we're going to see who gets injured. And they never tell the population that they're part of a clinical study. Under federal law, each of us are entitled to be informed if we're in a clinical study. We have anybody in the room that's been ever vaccinated has been denied informed consent. You're part of a clinical study and you don't know it. But Guillain-Barre syndrome can be fatal, especially if the patient receives no immunomodulatory treatments and the patient does not respond to immunomodulatory treatment. Given the diagnosis of ALS that came down, Michael Bailey was never given a modulatory treatment. So we don't know what that would have done. And when he was living, I was on the phone and I urged Jim Blumenstiel, and I talked with Mike, and I said, listen, we got to make sure that the doctors understand this report has to get to the doctor too. So we talked with the doctor, I won't mention his name, who initially did the vaccination and so on, and nothing came of it. So let's break this down. Dizziness supports headaches and dizziness, headaches, GBS, dizziness, GBS, rapid onset, GBS, rapid progression, GBS, pain, GBS, descending flaccid paralysis, GBS, reflexes, they were weak, supports GBS, numbness, GBS, tingling, GBS, loss of sensation, GBS, family history of ALS, no, GBS, loss of information processing speed, GBS, fasciculations, yes, ALS. One symptom supports ALS. Now, how did they come to the determination of ALS? Well, in the medical record where that diagnosis was given, it said there must have been some other pre-existing condition that we don't know about. Arm waving. There must have been, and I'm sorry to have to say this in front of the family, arm waving diagnosis, armchair diagnosis, when there's biomarkers that they can look at. There's genetic testing that should and could have been done. So speaking of genetic testing, just yesterday a report came in before Mr. Bailey died. I worked with the lawyers, Mr. Blumenstiel, and I worked with the doctor, and his doctor agreed to order a test. And we had what's called clinical exome sequencing. And the company asked us, well, what are you looking for? Which is not really fair. We should have not answered, right? You tell us what's going on with this patient. That's what we should have done. But I said, okay, we're trying to do differential diagnosis. There's a time frame when we have to get this done. The special master wants the results. We're looking for differential diagnosis of GBS and ALS. So out of all the variants that are there, and we all have tens of thousands of variants in our exome sequencing, they found one for which they then went to the literature and they found that there was a family who had ALS that had this mutation, and they said, therefore, it's a clinical test. 10 years ago, that wouldn't fly for clinical diagnosis. You have to have, it has to be more than 3% of the population, there has to be association studies, there's all this other stuff that has to be done. So while Jim was reading the report to me over the phone, I brought up PubMed and do what I do, and I'm looking at the scientific literature, and guess what? There's families out there that have this mutation that has GBS. So that particular genetic variant that they found, and we have thousands more to go through, it's equivocal, and yet that's what's on the report. So I have to do more analysis of it, and I'm going to do pathway analysis, and let's see if it matters, okay? What's my opinion on it? Well, there's a history of both GBS and ALS from vaccines, okay? My opinion, Mr. Bailey had a form of vaccine-induced autoimmune rapid onset progressive irreversible quadriplegic paralysis, loss of sexual, bladder, and bowel functions, total aphasia, and progressive cognitive decline. That's my opinion. I'm not a medical doctor, but that's what the science says that he had. Was it GBS or ALS? I'm not a medical doctor, but I don't think it should matter. What in the world, why in the world would this differential diagnosis matter? This man was paralyzed. This man's life was changed. His family was changed. Everything changed. Dr. Piorio said himself he couldn't provide a diagnosis of early ALS in part due to the immediacy of the onset of symptoms of his vaccination, but a diagnosis of ALS came anyway. We have one pro indication and we have so many down, negating indications that clearly Michael Bailey and his family deserve to be among the families who have been compensated by the National Vaccine Compensation Fund. It's semantics, medical semantics. What we call it shouldn't matter, but it does. Because there's one major difference between GBS and ALS. The difference that exists between GBS and ALS is that GBS is on the vaccine injury table, where compensations are allowed, and ALS is not. This has nothing to do with Mr. Bailey or his family or the vaccine. This has everything to do with the vaccine compensation program. So Braden Blumenstiel, Jim's son, is moving on to take over the cases that Jim's been working on, and Jim's going to help out as paralegal. And this morning, Mary Holland of New York University, who's on the IPAC advisory board, I asked her, do you know anything about how we get symptoms or outcomes put on the vaccine schedule? And she said HHS has control of the situation. It's long, it's arduous, it's a process. I'm trying to set up a conference call to discuss that further. But if you think about the way that this is set up, the system is rigged against the American public. The HHS has control of it. They're a litigant. They're not adjudicators. The Special Master Program is supposed to be independent and they're supposed to be unbiased. Why would the HHS? It's like saying, okay, you know what? Yeah, I came to your store and everything and I stole your money, but you can't count the 10s. I robbed your cash register, but you can't count the 20s. It's so arbitrary. You can't prosecute me for that because I wanted them. It's really wrong, the way that this is set up. So there needs to be an evolution in the National Vaccine Compensation Program, or, sticking my neck out here, there has to be a repeal of the National Vaccine Injury Act. Thank you.